Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining this session. I'm going to start by reading some recommendations and some reviews of the book, The British Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution. The first one goes, the book is a vital call to action, part historical investigation, part manifesto, demanding the reader to do away with the existing brutish museums of the title and find a new way for them to exist, not as sites of violence or trauma, but as sites of conscience. The second goes that Dan has written a masterful condemnation and inspiring call to action, urging that Western museums should return most of the artifacts that were taken from colonized countries. And a third recommendation or review states that Hicks, his vision of great museums returning hundreds of thousands of items to the possible descendants of the people who created them, in some cases, thousands of years ago. You're smiling, Dick, you know, Dan, you know which review this was. In some cases, thousands of years ago, strikes me as being so impractical on so many levels that it could only have come from someone who makes his living in an ivory tower that's actually stocked with ivory. The Guardian and Professor Erin Thompson respectively praised the research undertaken and the key recommendation highlighted in Dan Hicks's The British Museums to return the looted art to the communities from which they were taken. The Times, however, sees this call as some sort of career death wish. And the New York Times recently concluded that if you care about museums and if you care about the world, you should read this book. And so what is the book? What is the British Museums about? Well, if you walk into any European museum today, you will see the curated spoils of empire. They sit behind plate glass, dignified, tastefully lit. Accompanying pieces of card offer a name, date, and place of origin. They do not mention that the objects are all stolen. Few artifacts embody this history of extractive colonialism better than the Benin Bronzes, a collection of thousands of brass plaques and carved ivory tusks depicting the history of the royal court of the Obas of Benin City, Nigeria. Pillaged during the British naval attack in 1897, the loot was passed on to Queen Victoria, the British Museum, and countless private collections. The story of the Benin Bronzes sits at the heart of a heated debate about cultural restitution, repatriation, and the decolonization of museums. In the British Museums, Dan Hicks, the curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum and the professor of archaeology at the University of Oxford, makes a case for the urgent return of such objects as part of a wider project of addressing the outstanding debt of colonialism. So once again, good morning, good evening, everyone. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, you're on mute, Dan.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I was unable to unmute myself. So thanks so much. It's really nice to be here.
And congratulations as well on the accolade of being one of the best art books of 2020.
Yes, I know. That just came through, yesterday. And it's amazing. It's absolutely wonderful to see the New York Times review and to see the book in the art books of the year. Really great.
Excellent. So as mentioned, we definitely want this session to be interactive. So anyone, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, please pop it in the chat box. All you need to do is press on the chat icon at the bottom of your window, put your comment in there, and we will address it as we go along. A logistical note, again, this is being recorded. So if you want to ask any questions after the recording, please wait till after the presentation of the different chapters of the book, and we will address those questions then. And so much of the book includes sound bites, Dan, right? It includes single sentences that you could almost summarize as tweets. You can, capture the essence of that chapter in that single sentence or in that motto. And we kind of took that to underpin the different chapters that we're going to go through today, to summarize and have a discussion about the book and the various chapters.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a part of the reason that that works is that actually social media was an incredibly important, element in how the book was, written. Obviously, on the one side, it comes out of 13 years of thinking about the Pitt rivers. My role here as curator of world archaeology, but it also was a book that I wrote really quite fast, last year, and in which conversations internationally with their colleagues were enormously important.
And I think that leads us quite nicely into the first tweet, as it were, chapter 1, the gun that shoots twice. A paragraph or a sentence in this chapter, you state that the purpose of this book is to take stock of the use of anthropology museums during the 1890s as a weapon of the ideology of white supremacy in order to reclaim the vital function of these institutions, to put an end of their function as the warehouses of disaster capitalist colonialism. A bit of a mouthful, but how would you say you start off the book?
So it opens really with a line from Alan Boisregen, who was one of the officers involved in the Benin expedition, who talks about the rocket launcher and it's the way in which the bang, is a period of time before its actual descent and the damage it does. And he mocks the Bini people who dislike this, weapon. He says that they don't enjoy the fact that they hear the bang, they think they're safe, and then it lands, much at a point at which they thought they were out of range. So the book opens really with a comparison in between that idea and actually the idea of the presence of these objects over time here in our museums. To what extent are these objects, as we'll hear later, sort of unfinished events, but also to what extent are these displays things which cause hurt in the present? That's a really important theme of the book.
And it's interesting because there was an opinion from, well, as I was reading the book, one of the things that struck me actually was it almost seems like Benin City started once the British came to Nigeria. It almost seems like that history and that story started during that, punitive expedition. And there was an opinion that was submitted by a collector of African art when we, opened up the registration. And this collector said that I believe the book focuses on the Benin plaques. And to be honest, this is a topic I'm torn on, and not for the reason you may think. Unfortunately, activists focus all the energy on 1897. While that important horror can't be ignored, over-indexing on it does, in my view, an injustice to the scope of one of the most important kingdoms of the 18th to 19th centuries in Western Africa. This is a kingdom that traded as equals with the European countries before the Benin punitive expedition at the end of the 19th century. Having royal objects from the kingdom in the great museums of the world allows this story to be told. Would you agree with that sentiment that so much of the debate has, focused on Benin City, almost starting with that punitive expedition, not really focusing on the bigger picture of the kingdom?
Sure. So, I mean, yeah, my job as a curator is to understand objects which are currently in our care and to understand the way in which those objects are valued by people in the present. So, I'm not a historian. I'm an anthropologist, archaeologist, and a museum curator. Therefore, we begin with the present rather than necessarily the past. And, while the book absolutely crucially underlines the role of the role of Benin City in a whole host of urbanized civilizations in West Africa. It's a kingdom that reaches back in a single unbroken line earlier than Elizabeth I. I mean, this is a significant kingdom. But the book opens with the idea of Euro pessimism, the idea that for as long as these objects remain, having been looted and displayed in European museums, the overwhelming narrative, the sort of secondary historicity and the layering of the histories of the objects is that this overwhelming layer of the taking, of the violence, of the loss, means that it just entirely, you know, covers any ability for Europeans to talk about the value, significance, the religious and sovereign importance of these objects. So the process of return is one of undoing that layer so those important histories can be researched and understood and told in Nigeria.
Which then leads nicely to chapter 3 of the book, Necrography. The theft of an object by a European museum is a negative act. A kind of forensic death writing of the colonial museum is required of us. Forensic, because this is about understanding the truth of that scene of a crime. What do you mean by necrography?
So we're very familiar in art history with the idea of the, you know, life history of an object. It's a very familiar trope or if you like, sort of idiom, which we use unthinkingly. In archaeology and anthropology, it's the same. You know, we have talked since the 1980s of the, you know, the social life of things, of the cultural biography of objects. You know, that lens, that framing seemed to me as I was writing the book, a major part of the problem, entirely, really inappropriate for these histories, which were not about adding another layer, like a positive addition to these things, as if they were, you know, displaced people seeking a better life, you know, in a new home. These are histories, these movements are histories of loss, they're histories of death. You know, therefore the book takes Achille Mbembe's play on the Foucauldian idea of the biopolitical, where he inverts it and talks about the necropolitical, by which he means the politics in the contemporary world of who gets to live and who gets, you know, to die, as people try, for example, to enter Fortress Europe in the migration, you know, in the world of forced migration. For objects, you know, maybe we can do the same. So rather than the biographies of objects, let's talk about the necrographies. Let's talk about the death histories, the histories of loss. Let's foreground the fact that the history through which these objects were looted was one not of positivity and addition, but of taking and of death.
So a different way of looking at provenance, in essence, and questioning what provenance is.
This is absolutely about the provenance. I mean, at the heart of the book is a call for what some call the decolonisation of museums. That's not, you know, a framing that I use myself, but the work, whatever we call this work of understanding museums' relationship to, you know, these later phases of empire, it starts with actually, you know, maybe, you know, it is a surprise to some people that that work starts with the very conventional, you know, very often quite boring, you know, actually expert work of understanding provenance, working through archives, working from the object itself, trying to assemble our understanding of where these objects are now, not only the plaques, but all these other objects that were taken, you know, which I count up to more than 100,000 objects in total across all of the types of objects involved. So to do that work is at the heart of my vision of the necrographic. It's a sort of archaeology, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so jumping into chapter 4, white projection, the logic is quite straightforward. An alleged slight or offense is recorded in order to justify an open season on brutality by the supposed victim, who is in reality the aggressor. And so in this chapter, you're very much talking about the pretext to the punitive expedition. Can you describe the series of events that ultimately led to the looting and the burning and the destruction of Benin City?
So the book, you know, takes a longer term framing of the history of, you know, the British and the Germans and others, you know, up and down the Niger River. And it situates the Benin expedition, you know, in the context of a series of earlier attacks, removals of, you know, chiefs of kings at various points, whether it's the bombardment of Lagos, whether it is, you know, other events up and down the Niger River. At the heart of that is this logic which the book goes into, but also tries to talk about how that logic persists. And this is what's being called, white projection. So the projection side of it is the idea that you blame through a pretext the sheer violence of your own actions on some earlier slight, some earlier wrong. Sometimes that's a particular act, the breaking of a treaty, the killing of a small number of people. Sometimes it's a more general condition, the existence of non-Christian religion, the existence, the holding of slaves. These things are used as a pretext for the sheer violence that we see with the Maxim machine gun, the rocket launchers, the barbed wire, the electric lighting, the rifles and the dum-dum bullets used against bows and arrows. So that's the projection bit. The white part of it speaks to, if you like, the white supremacist, the racial dimension, which is there in the military justifications, but then also becomes refracted in the anthropology museum. We're quite familiar in anthropology with the idea that in the 1890s, 1880s, anthropology was really mortgaged to a whole set of, now completely outdated and offensive ideas of, racial types, as it were, the idea that there were different types of people, evolution happened within the human species, but we removed all of those displays. After the Second World War, the displays of different types of skulls. We never removed the displays that told the same story with art. We never removed the stories here at the Pitt Rivers of sort of cultural evolution, as it was told. So there you see the logic of the justification for this act ending up being refracted in that idea that, well, these things are safe here, and we're showing them here to justify our ability to care for objects, which, of course, in the case of Benin, had been cared for, in some cases, for more than 500 years. The lack of safety came from the British attack. These objects were hardly known. I mean, a couple of photographs, one object or two, given as gifts right at the end of the sequence, 1892, 1893. Largely, these objects were completely unknown. This artwork was kept safe from, Europeans until this attack. So that inversion, what the book says is that inversion, which was at the heart of a military propaganda, we reproduce that same logic in how we justify and always have justified the existence of these objects in museums. So punishment, reprisal lives on in our galleries in these ways.
And for those that don't know, because again, if you look at museums and you read those small plaques that describe the plaques, they often describe the punitive expedition as a result of not a small slight, but as a massacre of Phillips and his group as they tried to innocently trade with the Obas of Benin. So again, there was a kind of twisting of that history, wasn't there? A twisting of what happened to justify going in there ultimately for commercial gain.
So the book, drills into exactly who was killed. Was it 9? Was it 5? How can we be, were the carriers killed or not? What's the evidence? It also puts the continual attempt to variously attack or visit the Oba in this sacred season around, what for the British would have been Christmas time, to make this attack or this approach at a time when it was known that the Oba would be unable to receive visitors. I argue that almost certainly the technique that was being aimed for was an attempt to visit and the desire to then say we were refused a hearing, and therefore that would justify it. But of course, the deaths of these handful of white men was even better in terms of the propaganda. But what was very clear, as the book says, is the attack was already planned. Long before the Phillips expedition, the attack was already being planned and was hand in hand with the attack of the Royal Niger Company, which happened at the same time in northern Nigeria.
And that leads us to the sacking of Benin City. The sacking of Benin City in February 1897 was a crime against humanity that mapped onto three elements of the Hague Convention: the indiscriminate attack on human life, in which tens of thousands died, the purposeful and proactive destruction of an ancient cultural and religious royal site, and the looting of sacred art. So in this chapter, what are you describing? You're describing, what exactly took place at Benin City. How did you get insight into what happened?
So I aim to draw together really as many of the archival, the newspaper, the primary and secondary sources as I could, to try and take another look at how we describe the sacking. The Hague Convention is very important because it comes, the meeting actually about the Hague Convention is in 1898, in advance of it being published in 1899. And there's no doubt in my mind at all that the Benin attack, which was so significant and so renowned at that time, was uppermost in the mind of those who called that meeting. And, the first convention of the two Hague Conventions being enacted, to make, really to make illegal what this atrocity, which happened in the name of corporate colonialism, in the name of extractive colonialism, in the name of the rubber industry, of the palm oil industry. I tried to piece together what we might know about the number of people who died, comparisons with the death toll which are recorded in more detail in the very different fighting conditions in the north, where really a cavalry, essentially a medieval cavalry, are mown down, with a Maxim machine gun. I had not appreciated until writing the book the significance of the Maxim machine gun in this history. So the approach, the naval approach that's taken, is to take, dozens of these Maxims into the bush, to cut down the jungle, to advance, and to rake the jungle with these bullets. 3 million bullets are listed in, the first-hand reports of actually what was involved in this operation. It's a big operation, and the sheer violence of that, I wasn't expecting, really.
You mentioned Maxim gun over 40 times in the book. And, one of the things that, but it's interesting because one of the things that I discovered actually is that the Maxim gun the machine gun was almost tested in Africa before it was used in the World War, right? It was tested on African bodies to see the effect that it would have and the devastation that it would cause, as you say. And they were pitted against bows and arrows, as you describe in chapter 5. But again, I'm aware of the time. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A because a lot of questions were submitted. And so if we, and this is a picture actually quite impactful picture that I don't think a lot of people have seen. What are we seeing here, Dan?
So this is a photograph from the Walker album. There are other versions of this print as well. The man on the left is a familiar figure to people that know the photographic history of the Benin 1897 attack, because he's shown on the left-hand side of the more familiar photograph of the men crouching with the bronzes laid out around them. But here we see the willful, active destruction of, the palaces of the cities, which was central to the razing, the sheer sacking. Of course, also the creation of a golf course within weeks on this site as they were installing the British resident. So I think this photograph, among others in the Walker Diary, which we recently accessioned at the Pitt Rivers, thanks to the kind donation of Mark Walker, who is the grandson of Herbert Walker, who served in this expedition. This captures, it isn't a story we're used to telling or to hear. It isn't a dimension of the story we're used to hearing. So the colonial violence in the chapter of the book is one really important, element which I felt has been overlooked in the story and which I aim, to bring into view.
And so onto the art. We've talked about the history. The first few chapters really talk about the history, what led up to the punitive expedition, what took place when the soldiers were in the city and in the kingdom. And then chapter 12 goes on to talk about the looting. Let us be clear on this point. The arrival of loot into the hands of Western curators, its continued display in our museums, and its hiding away in private collections, it's not some art historical incident of reception, but an enduring brutality that is refreshed every day that an anthropology museum like the Pitt Rivers opens its doors. Now, we did receive a lot of questions about, Dan, your role as a curator in a museum that still houses all of this loot. And we've just got a new comment as well about how you're changing that signage. And we'll come on to that when we open up for Q&A. But talk to us about the looting chapter, the bronzes that were stolen, the ivories that were taken, apparently to pay for the punitive expedition.
Sure. So I always believed what I had been told about the Benin expedition, that the looting, there was some kind of grim logic or justification to it, because the sale of these objects officially had to cover the costs of a necessary attack. Mm-hmm. That house of cards has fallen apart, piece by piece as I wrote the book. Not only the question, of course, of the justification, as we've covered, but also the idea of the sale of the loot. So I searched and searched in the first months of wanting to understand this for the documentation of this big auction organized, by the Crown agents or by the British government or the Colonial Office or the Foreign Office. It didn't happen. That is not what happened. 300 of the plaques, of the 1,200 plaques, were brought back and found their way into the British Museum, of which 200 were kept and 100 variously distributed and a handful sold. We don't know what happened to the ivory, the store of ivory, in terms of uncarved ivory. We don't know there. I say in the book, maybe there's a Hamburg-based ivory dealer who's in the mix here. Maybe they turn into billiard balls into the keys on harpsichords or pianos. But largely, the vast majority of what was taken, those 10,000 objects, it's taken, as you see in the famous photograph on the right-hand side, by individual officers, colonial administrators and others, simply enriching themselves. And therefore, the sheer chaotic free-for-all that was involved as these things found their way into private collections. Some were sold immediately via various dealers. Pitt Rivers himself, in the second collection, his second museum, acquired 270 or so of these things from those soldiers, from other dealers. But then these other things find their way in families. They're passed down as heirlooms. They're sold when people die. It's just a mess. So and then what's happening in the acquisition? So quickly, ethnological museums are acquiring these objects. Within weeks, they're on display in London, Berlin and Oxford. But what I learned is that those displays, as we've already covered, their relationship to stories of cultural supremacy, cultural evolution, meant really that these displays were themselves acts of violence. They were defined really to tell the story of this victory, and thereby to reignite and repeat that violence every day for many of our visitors, certainly in the present. And that was one of the real kind of aha moments of this work for me, realizing sort of gradually the idea that this wasn't, it's a bit like nuclear waste. This can still hurt people. And it wasn't a side effect of empire. The museum was being used as a central technology for the justification for telling a certain story, a certain view of the world, which we, if we're not careful, we still repeat, today.
Necrology. We talked about necrography, which in essence is reframing how we think about provenance, is looking at that death list, as you call it, of the people that have been involved in that piece or in that artwork. So then with necrology, you say, how then to begin to think through what cultural restitution means in the ongoing circumstances of extractive colonialism in West Africa? One first step is to understand not the life history, but the lost, to slice open the museum and to see the cancer inside. Here the necrography begins. So necrography versus necrology, what concepts are you introducing in this chapter? And what are you saying to the curators and to the collectors out there? Because we really have a mix on this call of collectors, curators, scholars. What are you saying in this chapter?
So the knowledge, which I think everyone in this call, cares about, which is the knowledge of, provenance, the knowledge of how that sort of secondary historicity that I've mentioned, that in the museum remains so overwhelming, so suffocating for the real meanings of these objects and their significance in Nigeria, to the Royal Court and others. That knowledge is what I'm calling necrology. It is a knowledge of loss. It's a knowledge formed of death. And that, for me, is until restitution happens, that's all we're going to be producing. Therefore, to tell those histories, I foreground each of the men that took these things so that we can try to do the genealogical, the case by case, the work one person after another about where are these? I mean, we have the we just saw the name Egerton flash up. We have, the Egerton material on loan here and have had for a long time. Much less is known. Some is known about some of these names appear in auction catalogues at certain points, others don't. The book begins to list those men who were involved in the expedition and to say what we know, but it's a work in progress. And wonderful to see Herbert Walker at the end there, because Mark Walker's central work as his grandson in returning to Benin Bronzes in 2014 to the Royal Court, his ongoing support for this work and our work with him is one example of what so many other descendants, may wish actually to do in the future.
And it's modern history. I mean, that was what, 2 generations. This is his grandson that still has these pieces and returned them back to the community.
Yeah, that's the shock, I think. It's so recent. And it's not, when we think about empire, in the UK, we generally think, or when we think about our role as a nation internationally, we maybe think about empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. We maybe get as far as abolition in 1807. We maybe get as far as emancipation in 1838. But then there's this big Queen Victoria-sized, gap or blind spots, and suddenly we're in 1914 and it's the First World War. That's our next maybe we stop off at the Crimean War along the way. But in every year of Victoria's reign, there were these expeditions being undertaken. And even expedition makes it sound like it's a Boy Scout operation. It's fun, it's lightweight. This is the scramble for Africa. It was not a fight in between Europeans elbowing each other out of the way, as I was taught at school. It was an attack upon Africa. And the loss of life, the mission creep for the naval operations that began with the abolitionist movement and would continue to be justified by that. But it's the same outfit, the Admiralty outfit based at this point in Cape Town, at the Cape, the Cape of Good Hope. They're the people that are attacking, the Benin Kingdom in 1897. We need to understand these histories much better. For the First World War, we can tell the history of every day, every operation, every minute detail. Go back just a couple of years earlier in Africa. We don't even know the names of a number of these expeditions. So a lot of my work sort of going forward is really, to try to get these histories of these expeditionary attacks understood and the relationship of them to the museum actually much more clearly.
And so in the final few chapters of the book, 16, 18, 17, 19, you start to introduce the concept of restitution. And you actually, in chapter 16, highlight that this isn't anything new, that first claim for restitution, began way back in 1936 by the then Obas of Benin, where he successfully got back 2 coral crowns and a coral bead garment from the UK. So in this introduction of restitution, however, you also highlight some of the challenges and objections against restitution, things like Britain was a legitimate authority in the land, the universal museum concept, saving world culture, Nigeria might sell off its art. Nigeria should buy back its art. What are some of the different objections that you identified, and how did you respond to them in this chapter here?
So some of them, yeah, maybe we can talk about in the conversation afterwards, but certainly in this chapter, importantly, I try to give restitution a history. So often when the media cover this question, when it's discussed, it's almost like people, like that Times review, they return to first principles, almost like moral or ethical principles, like someone just thought of this, like last week, and we've got to work it out from nothing. Akenzo II's, demands 85 years ago, that led to the British Museum overseeing the return of objects on loan to them, these, royal objects of the crown and the garment there, which we see in the photograph. They're just a few incidents along the way, the selling off of the plaques by the British Museum in the 1950s, the fact that some of the collectors in New York, were given, maybe by exchange or maybe by sale, objects from the British Museum in as late as the 1970s. These are histories that we need to understand in order to contextualize, in order to understand that restitution hasn't come out of nowhere, and importantly, that it's an African-led movement. So the universal museum rhetoric that we're so used to since 2002, is a very recent layer. It's a very, very recent argument, and it's a very thin one, which I, in the book, attempt, really, to demolish.
And you try to demolish it by stating in chapter 18 that to pretend that the violence is over is the technique used by museums, galleries, sales rooms, and private collections that hold looted Benin objects when they claim that they have been acquired legally at the most recent transaction. And so no question of restitution should arise. So in your argument here, it's almost saying, at what point does a stolen object no longer become stolen? How many hands does it need to pass through, or how many people need to exchange a piece before it's no longer a looted piece? Is that the argument? Are you saying that it's forever stolen?
Yeah, I mean, how many times does a thief have to pass it on to another, sell it on, they sell it on, they sell it on? Let's say, as some of it, in the case of some of the Benin objects in museums, they change hands 14 or 15 times. Is it any less stolen at the end of that series of exchanges or sales? I find it very hard to believe that anyone would argue that's right. The book introduces the notion of each of these objects as an event. These are unfinished objects. They're unfinished, histories, each of them. And therefore, if they can move from one context to another, not in that positive layering of histories, when we read a catalogue, when we look at an auction catalogue and we see that list of, let's say it was in the second Pitt Rivers collection, acquired from one of the dealers that we know well, sold off, passed by George to Stella, sold off in the 1960s, moved to often ends up in New York or Paris. It moves about a couple of times, ends up in the Met or wherever. That history is not some happy life history of adding positive layers. Each time it moves from one hand to another, this immense history of loss, I think, is added to. So yeah, I mean, the moral justification that you acquired it legally yourself, simply, it might be legally, technically true, but I just don't think it washes in this day and age, really.
And so in the afterword, 10,000 looted Edo works, 10,000 unfinished events, 10 years of returns is what you call for.
Yes, I do. So, I mean, this isn't going to happen quickly, but it's definitely gaining pace. And I think it's a case-by-case approach to objects in museums. But for me, as a curator that loves anthropology, that loves, my workplace, that believes that we've never needed something like a world culture museum more than we do at this time in history to tell the story of art and creativity outside of a conventional, Eurocentric lens. I want to have that museum and work in that museum without having to live with these ongoing, presences of a short period, relatively short period in the history of the museums where they were co-opted for the purposes of, proto-fascism, white supremacy, extreme violence, and the justification of horror. These objects when they're asked for to be returned, those requests are coming, from an informed place, from a knowledge that these objects matter. They matter for sovereignty. They matter for belief. They matter for culture. Of course they matter, because that's why they were taken. That's why this happened in the first place. So yeah, for me, a decade of returns, not looking outside from the case only of Benin, to question each of these objects. I want to work in a museum, where nothing is stolen. I want to work in a museum where African art is not only from the past, it's in the present, where we commission African artists in the present. I want to, exactly as anthropology as a discipline has, I want a museum as our public space for our academic disciplines of archaeology and anthropology, art history as well. I want a public space that is not out of step with how we think as anthropologists, today, and one that doesn't hurt people, one that can be a space. If this is a weapon, a battlefield, a site of loss, we have to learn from other ways in which, truth and reconciliation, in which the remembrance of loss in contexts of war has happened. There are many examples from South Africa to Northern Ireland, to the continent of Europe and elsewhere. But that's the challenge ahead, is to see our museums as in part sites of conscience, in part the celebration of creativity and making, to support the reinvention of museums on an African model, but ultimately, to give things back, when they are demanded.
And that's really how you conclude. You conclude by calling on the reader to write the conclusion by taking action.
We've had enough of your dialogue. We need dialogue, but let's see action-oriented dialogue.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan.
Time's up. That's the conclusion.